Glad to see you all here. So my name is Jason Grillo. I'm the director for AirMiners. Seeing a lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well in the crowd today. So we're here as the result of some excellent work that a team of AirMiners did working on what's called a problem pack or climate sprint. They did such a great job at a supply curve model that was part of a climate sprint that I thought it would be great to share because it provides some of the industry-wide, really groundbreaking insights about how our otherwise, frankly, supply-constrained market might develop across different methodologies of carbon removal. So that's the, in a nutshell, while we're here. If you are interested in learning more about problem packs or climate sprints, you can go look at climatesprints.com. The program itself is organized by John Sanchez, for those of you who are familiar with him. So so the idea is that we'll have today that we'll have some remarks by one thing, the Stripe team, who are keenly interested in this as well, but also have a presentation by the team itself. A bit of a departure from our typical event where we usually have a panel of people talking in conversation. We'll have a presentation by the team itself for a while, then open it up to Q&A for all of you to ask questions about the model, ask and learn from them. I'll come on at the Ryan Orbuck and Hannah Bebbington will offer some remarks as well from the Stripe team. And at the conclusion of today, I'll be back with some announcements about some extremely exciting developments that are going on with AirMiners. Also, as we typically do, I'll open up at the top of the hour after we're done. We'll start with some Zoom networking. Don't feel obligated to stay, but a lot of people enjoy not just getting to know of each other, but actually getting to know each other and to collaborate with each other as a result of some of the randomized Zoom networking that happens with breakout rooms that we'll do after the 60 minutes we have today's up. So without further ado, those are my housekeeping items, and I will hand the floor over to Hannah Bebbington. Hannah.
Hey everyone, I'm Hannah Bebbington and I lead strategy for Stripe Climate. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan Orbuck, who leads procurement. Both of us will stick around for Q&A, but wanted to give a brief overview of what we do and why this is such important work before we dive in. So at Stripe Climate, our intent is to get as much money into the pot for frontier carbon removal as possible. And the reason is because when we look to what the world needs to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we think we're going to need about 10 gigatons of permanent carbon removal every single year starting in 2050. But the carbon removal system, as many of us on the phone here know, is dramatically behind. There are no current technologies that can scale to the full size of the problem. Many organizations today are operating at very small scales and high prices. Some of this data you'll see in the presentation from the AirMiners folks. We use funds raised into Stripe Climate to purchase carbon removal from nascent, high potential businesses with the hope that they'll grow and scale in the future. Today, we have 10 organizations in our portfolio, 4 from our 2020 purchase and 6 from our 2021 purchase. And we really aim to be the first customer for these really early stage carbon removal businesses. So for 7 of the 10 organizations that we support, we were in fact their first buyers. The work AirMiners have done here today is so critical because we at Stripe are trying to understand how close or far are we from what the world needs by 2030 or by 2050. And frankly, how successful have we at Stripe been in helping to catalyze this market? So we just want to underscore how really cool it is that the AirMiners group pulled the data that we publish publicly and did this work for us and for the field. You know, based on our own estimates of our portfolio projections, we are nowhere near the 1 gigaton goal that the world would need to hit by 2030. But realistically, like forecasting this stuff is super, super hard, as the AirMiners team will tell you. And so we're really grateful for all the organizations collaborating on this. You know, ultimately, though, sort of no matter which way you slice and dice the pie and whatever scenario you think we may end up in, best case or worst case, there's just like not enough carbon removal supply coming online to meet the goals. ultimately, our biggest challenge today then is company starts. So the portfolio that the Stripe Climate team supports and other organizations are buying from is a good start, but it's just like not nearly enough for what the world needs. And so to solve this problem, we need more organizations to go out and start doing carbon removal today. We are excited for communities like AirMiners to be working on this. And if there's one call to action to everyone on the phone today, it's like, go out there and start a carbon removal company. If you're working on something, please drop us a line at Stripe Climate. We would love to hear what you're working on. And if you don't know where to start, the folks on this call and the folks in the AirMiners Slack community are like a great place to start batting around ideas. And so without further ado, and without sort of batting you all over the head with your carbon removal company start call to action, we'd love to turn it over to the AirMiners team. And again, like huge thank you for this work. It is like truly important for what we do at Stripe and for the ecosystem writ large. So Ryan, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. That really set us up well. So I think we should just dive right in. Jason, go ahead, if you can go ahead and share your screen, we can get started.
Yep.
Excellent.
1 second.
Wonderful. Okay. So the work we're going to show you today was focused on understanding how CDR might fit into the existing and future carbon offset demand market, right? So we want to look deeper into the data regarding CDR cost, the available supply today, and try to understand how the cost and supply are going to change over time. You can go to the next slide. So let's just bring us back to all the same page. Corporate demand for carbon offsets is rising. The number of companies setting net zero emissions targets is growing exponentially. It's literally looks like it's doubling every year. The number of new companies. So while it's easy to say that your company is going to have a net zero emissions target and you're going to hit it, traditional emission reduction offsets can't be used to reach net zero emissions, which means that CDR and CDR offsets will be required to hit those targets. And so that's going to, like as Hannah just said, it's going to put a lot of pressure on CDR supply to grow. So just for an order of magnitude scale perspective, right? The Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets expects demand for CDR to be around 2 billion or 2 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2030. That is a stretch. As you'll see later in our data, that's pretty hard to meet, and it's kind of fits our best case scenario, right? So like Anna said, if you have a company idea, get started, because this is an all hands on deck situation. We wanted to see if supply can meet that demand and at what cost, but we also wanted to look at the existing CDR companies' expectations for scaling up and compare that to biophysical and economic constraints. You can go to the next slide. So if you haven't seen it before, this is the Oxford Taxonomy for classifying carbon offsets. It's pretty useful. Traditional offsets are the red boxes on the left, types 1, 2, and 3. They're labeled there. These refer to emissions reductions, including type 1 is avoiding emissions, type 2 is delaying emissions via short-term carbon storage. Type 3 is storing emissions for the long term, employing point source CCS. The focus of our work and what we're going to show mostly today is carbon removal offsets in the blue there on the right side, types 4 and 5. Generally, type 4 includes short-term carbon storage CDR, including mostly nature-based, but not always. And type 5 is removal with long-term storage, mostly engineered solutions, but not always. You can go to the next. So unfortunately, the quality of most offsets makes them practically worthless with respect to climate impact. This has been kind of proven a couple times. There's a lot of big investigative journalism coming out saying that something like close to 80% even of traditional offsets are just worthless. And that's potentially harmful, of course, because that's money being spent on worthless offsets. It could have been used for real mitigation. So this has obviously led to a lot of companies being called out for greenwashing, but it's also put a lot of pressure on carbon markets to improve quality and create transparent metrics to prove that these things are actually working. CDR offsets inherently have higher quality than traditional emissions reductions offsets, mostly because the additionality constraint is more certain. It's easier to prove for CDR. However, it's still tricky to apply CDR towards net zero carbon accounting. So if you purchase a CDR offset and it leaks or burns down in the next few years, that has to be replaced to reinstate that stored carbon to maintain the net zero claim. So that created a data headache that we're going to try to address. In the next few minutes, actually, Jason will tell you how we tried to quantify the cost to maintain permanence forever, which is a cool little exercise. But for now, I'll turn it over to Jenny to explain the current state of the carbon offset market.
Awesome. Well, so thank you, Ryan. So here we'll just put some numbers on kind of the current and historic state of basically carbon offsetting. And so here in these two plots, we're plotting data from when we initially did this analysis. It was a kind of hot off the presses, newly released, so came out in April, database of the voluntary carbon offsets, like a whole historic database of what that's looked like through time that came out of UC Berkeley. And so there are three things that I would like to highlight about this database. What do we see from this database? One, these offsets are completely dominated by emissions reductions. So there's very little net carbon removal. Two, that the issuance of these offsets, though, has risen significantly through time. So that's what we're looking at here. On the left, compound annual growth rate of 30% over the last decade. So that's signaling a significant rise in demand. But three, those offsets are really cheap. So the volume weighted average of all these offsets in 2018 was $3.30 per ton. So that's you're getting carbon removal for it's not going to hurt your wallet. But so next slide, please. So that said, while these emissions reductions offsets are going for very cheap, higher quality carbon removal does demand a premium price. And so what we're looking at here as we move into both emissions reductions, carbon offsets that are associated with permanent removal. So talking about point source CCS with permanent storage, and our net carbon removal, specifically net carbon removal with mid to high levels of permanent storage associated with it, you are demanding a price premium. So they're asking and receiving a higher price per ton of CO2 removed. So next slide. But the thing to realize with these numbers, while they're demanding a price premium, those premium prices are associated with a real paucity of supply volume. So that's what we're looking at here on the left. The blue bars are telling us the supply volume. On the X, we're looking at our different offset types that Ryan introduced. And then the red squares are showing you the volume weighted average cost of that removal or emissions reduction offset. And so, while you're getting a price premium for these permanent storage options, that's associated with very, very low supply volume. So even if I said, I really want, to pay a very high premium for high quality, super permanent carbon removal options, the supply just isn't there. Now, the real caveat though here is, especially when I'm talking about net carbon removal options with this mid to high level of permanence, we're talking about very nascent industries. And so these are, a lot of the times engineered solutions that are really just starting to scale. And so to put that into context, what we're looking at here on the right is data from the 2020 set of Stripe request for proposals, looking at just for the next 5 years. So what the companies that put in an RFP to Stripe, what they're projecting out, how their their cost and supply volume will change over the next 5 years. And what we see is that for these, really long permanence, high permanence net carbon removal solutions, they're projecting both very rapid declines in costs and increases in scale over the next 5 years. And so what we wanted to really dig into with this exercise was the question, is this enough? Is this going to be enough? Try and project out for kind of carbon removal market as a whole, how fast are we going to be able to scale? How fast will those prices fall? And will that be enough to meet demand for the next decade and beyond? And so pass it over to Jason to really dig into the data.
Awesome, thanks. So to kind of echo what Jenny said, what we did is we took that data from Stripe's request for proposal process and we just plotted it in different ways. So as part of that process, companies that were submitting proposals to Stripe had to submit what volume they can supply in the year 2020, what price they could supply that volume at, and they also had to make projections 5, 10, 15 years out for how they thought the prices and supply would evolve. So for example, here we have a graph. We have an x-axis, y-axis. X-axis, we show what volume is a given company proposing to sell in the year 2020 here in the top left. And then on the y-axis, we have the cost per ton that the company is willing to sell at. As we get into this plot, we should note that our goal is to get kind of like down here to the bottom right. So we want to get to the scale, to the sort of gigaton scale by 2030. This axis only goes up to the 10 megaton scale. So we have 2 additional orders of magnitude over here. We'll eventually expand the graph to the right. And then of course we want credits that are as cheap as possible. So $10 is going to be way more attractive to companies than 400. Okay, we should also say we color the companies by their industry. So forestry, soil, biomass, ocean, and so on. We use the colors, the same colors that Carbon Plan uses. You can check out more about the data they released here. So let's just look at one example company. So Project Vesta, accelerated mineralization, accelerated weathering, I guess. They proposed to sell 200 tons to Stripe at a price of $50 per ton. Here we have Charm Industrial using a different technical process, offering to sell 10,000 tons, so a bit higher volume at a much steeper price tag of, in this case, 600. And we can basically just plot all the companies that submitted proposals. This is a little bit confusing, a lot of words, so we kind of reduce this to just 1 point per company, showing the industry that the company is in. So we can see a couple things. First, we have these direct air capture approaches, kind of in the top left. So the most expensive approaches, this is where you have huge fans and adsorbents, basically sucking CO2 molecules directly from the air, creating a concentrated CO2 stream, and then doing something with that, like injecting it underground. So these are expensive, they're reliable, so every ton that you inject, it's super reliable. It's in the ground, and people have shown that it kind of sticks around for 1,000 years or something. Pretty trustworthy. However, the scales are kind of still nascent, still comically small. So we have 10 tons on offer, maybe this is 60 or 70 here. What is that? 8 orders of magnitude lower than we're gonna eventually need by 2030. As we go down to the bottom right, we see different approaches. Some of the cheapest approaches here are these soil credits in orange and the forestry credits in green. So on the one hand, it kind of seems that these credits are ahead right now. So in 2020, these credits they have the highest volume on offer, and they're the cheapest credits. So basically they're the closest to this bottom right corner. This is great news, like we're making progress and they're ahead of the pack. However, there's a little caveat, which Jenny and Ryan alluded to, which is that these credits are less permanent. So whereas one of these tons sequestered via direct air capture and pumped into the ground, we can basically see via some tests, I suppose, I'm not super educated about this, that they mineralize into rock. So it's gonna be there for a long time. Forestry credits, as we've seen in the last couple of years, you might pay to plant forests or pay to maintain forests, and then a fire sweeps through and burns your credits. And now that offset that you used to have, you kind of no longer have. It's burned up, it's gone back into the air. And to return your company, say, to net zero, you're going to need to buy new credits. So the first thing we wanted to do to compare all these types of credits more fairly and kind of on even grounds is to somehow project them all to the same basis. So we kind of want to integrate out this non-permanence aspect. To get into that, we can think about the following thought experiment. So let's say you were willing to pay $500 for 1 ton sequestered via direct air capture, which would last nominally 1,000 years or more. Basically, it lasts forever. If you're willing to pay $500 for that, how much would you be willing to pay for 1 ton sequestered via regenerative agriculture, whose time scale is much shorter, something like 15 years. So you have a contract with a farmer to use no-till, to use some regenerative grazing, something like this. They will sequester carbon, it will be in the soil, you can measure it, but realistically, farms change hands, contracts expire, this sort of thing. Maybe let's say those tons are only around for 15 years, and then they kind of evaporate into they leak into the atmosphere. On a more extreme example, there's a company, Sylvia Terra, or now called NCX, that sells simply 1 year delayed harvest. So there's a landowner that has a bunch of trees on his or her property, and the landowner agrees to delay harvesting those trees by 1 year. Let's say you purchase 1 ton worth of those trees for only 1 year. How much should you be willing to pay for that ton? Can we project these all to a common basis? So the way we thought about it is what we did is we plotted each type of ton you might buy, and then asked over time on the x-axis how much of that ton would be left on the y-axis. So for direct air capture, you buy a ton at year 0, and then it just lasts forever. So the line is flat. On the other hand, if you buy a soil ton, maybe it falls off with some time constant. Maybe that time constant is something like 15 years. On the extreme angle, on the extreme end, these 1-year forestry credits, they last for exactly 1 year and then they drop off, and the landowner literally cuts the trees down and sells the lumber or whatever. So what we did is we modeled all of these processes, although they're not exactly exponential leakage, we modeled them as exponential leakage. So we said every atom of carbon that you purchase at year 0 has some fractional constant probability of leaking every single year, which results in this kind of exponential curve. Then what we're going to say is, what we're going to assume is, if as a company you purchase a ton of a given quality or given permanence at year 0, and then after 1 year a certain amount of it leaks, what you have to do to get your whole ton back is purchase a fraction of a ton 1 year in the future. And then the second year when things leak, you need to purchase another fraction to continue kind of topping up your balance. So in this simple model, which we call a forever ton, the cost of a forever ton is the present cost of all future non-permanent tons, including the kind of cost of capital over time. So just to be clear, you purchase one non-permanent ton at year 0. At year 1, you purchase 1 over P, so some fraction of a non-permanent ton. At year 2, year 3, year 4, and so on, you purchase all these non-permanent tons. We sum this series out to infinity, taking into account the cost of capital, and you get this simple equation for the equivalent cost of a forever ton up here at the top left. So we only have this only depends on 2 quantities. First, the permanence P, so how many years it takes before a ton leaks. So what is the time scale of an exponential curve? And the cost of capital C. So capital costs you more today than it costs in the future. So if you take that into account, then this infinite sum is not in fact infinity every time, because capital gets cheaper and cheaper. You just need to ask, like, what amount of money would you need to put in the bank today for the interest on that investment to be able to pay for your future tons? Okay, so back to our original data. Here's the plot I showed you before. Every point is represented by its kind of sticker price. As a hint here, which we'll see in a second. This point is actually the Sylvia Terra NCX price for 1 year worth of a ton. So that's the sticker price, including the non-permanence. If we flip to this new view, where we convert the prices to forever tons at a weighted average cost of capital of 5%, you can see all these points basically move up by some amount. So here's before, after. You can see some of the tons, these purple tons, are not really moving at all because they're very permanent. They basically don't leak. The one that moves the most is this ton out here, which, like I said, is only 1 year worth. So if you buy a ton for 1 year, and it costs you something like $15 at a cost of capital of 5%, it costs you equivalently $200 to buy the series of tons you'll need to kind of backfill that buffer. It's worth noting that some companies are varying degrees of honest about how the non-permanence works. And in particular, this company out here, which is Sylvia Terra NCX, huge props to them. The reason they're using this 1 year model is because they wanted to be very upfront from the beginning about how this non-permanence works. They sell exactly 1 year worth, and they say companies can kind of do with that what they want. They actually have their own internal model for what multipliers should be used by companies. I believe it's simply 20. They came up with 20 using different means. The effective multiplier here is 13 or 14 in our model because of our cost of capital and so on. So maybe we came up with some slightly different numbers. The point is, there are already companies buying credits using these types of multipliers. Okay, so a couple interesting conclusions here between our old picture and our new picture. In our new picture, even when taking into account the cost of non-permanence, so soil, these orange points here, are now kind of commensurate cost as many other approaches, so still in this range. Sort of surprisingly to us, forestry is still cheaper. So this is kind of an interesting conclusion. Even when you take into account the fact that forests burn and they're not reliable, if you're willing to kind of replant trees and so on, or repurchase credits via whatever means, once your forests burn, that can still be an efficient method of sequestering carbon. Okay, what's next? Next, what we're going to look at is every company, in addition to submitting their supply available this year, 2020, last year, they were also asked to make projections over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So we chose not to editorialize these projections too much. We're just going to plot them. Some of them may be quite optimistic. We actually found in the plots not shown here that companies that were earlier and had less, they were earlier in their process, tended to be more optimistic. As they looked to the future, it looked rosier because it was further away. Companies that have been in the space for a while realize that their tons are kind of expensive and they're not going to get super, super cheap in 5 years or 3 years or something. In any case, we just plotted directly how companies said their ton prices would evolve. And you get this kind of fairly confusing animated chart going out to 2035. You can see in the top left corner. So most companies are going down to the bottom right. So they're saying we're going to be able to provide more and more tons of carbon sequestration at cheaper and cheaper prices. But there are, of course, limits. So there's a lot going on here. So what we did is a small amount of aggregation and editorializing. We reduced all of those points to simply points that represent like the industry as a whole in these different areas. So we have BECCS, biochar, all of soils, all of farming practices here, different types of forestry management, and so on. Then finally, we should say also, yeah, we have a log linear relationship between cost and available supply. So again, this kind of line going from the top left to the bottom right. What we then did is we took all of these points and we kind of computed in NumPy. It would be a cum sum, a cumulative sum from cheapest to most expensive to create what is a supply curve. So if you remember from economics, you have like a supply curve and a demand curve, and they cross, and wherever they cross, that's the price that the assets will be traded at. We can turn this type of graph into a supply curve and animate how it will evolve in future years to see, what are the cheapest 1 million or 10 million tons available. So I'll turn it back to Jenny to talk about that.
Awesome. Well, so here we're looking at this, supply cost curve for the current state of affairs. So carbon removal in 2020. And what we see is that we're really dominated by our nature-based solutions. So basically, it's mostly forestry and soil carbon sequestration is what's making up the bulk of our removal. And so then projecting out a little bit into the future, into 2025. So next slide. Or actually, while we're still on this slide, the other thing to really emphasize is that the number of our current, volume weighted offset selling at $3 a ton, $3.30 a ton, that's off the scale. It's off the y-axis. It's really cheap. Everything that we're talking about here is significantly more expensive. But so now going into 2025, we see the picture actually looks pretty similar. You'd say nothing really changed, but the thing to realize is that our x-axis has basically increased by a factor of 10. And so out into 2025, we're still dominated by our nature-based solutions, forestry and soil carbon sequestration, but we're kind of total aggregate carbon removal is now approximately 10 times higher. And then so that going through the end of the decade, what we see is that we actually, admittedly these are relatively rosy projections, but we're actually, projecting total supply is more than a gigaton per year. And I think the important metric to compare to here is what Ryan introduced initially, was the estimate from the Task Force of Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, estimating between 1.5 and 2 gigatons of demand for carbon removal in 2030. And so what we're seeing here is that these projections say we could probably meet that demand, but the vast majority of that removal is going to be supplied by our relatively less permanent nature-based solutions, basically, again, forestry and soil carbon. And so to put that in a little bit more context, though, if I wanted to purchase this, I'm going to get my wallet out and say, I actually want to buy this amount of carbon removal. We see if I want to buy, the cheapest 1.5 gigatons to meet that demand, I need $33 billion. But I'm really only buying forestry offsets. And then, so if I want to get my next half gigaton, get me up to the full 2 gigatons of demand, I basically need to double that. So now I need 56 billion to get my 2 gigatons of demand. But again, I'm still buying relatively cheap nature-based solutions. If I want the whole shebang, my full 2.5 gigatons of demand, I need $100 billion. So basically, I need another $50 billion to get my half gigaton of really nearing pretty permanent net carbon removal. And so, that gives us a little bit of kind of intuition for what we're talking about in terms of, monetary needs here. But I think the thing to really emphasize is this is actually not that much money. Even if I want to buy the whole thing, $100 billion is, 0.5% of US GDP in 2019. And so this is within reach according to these projections. And then so just continuing on, if we go past the end of the decade out to 2035, now we're really starting to get more of our permanent engineered solutions are starting to scale and come down in price. So what we're projecting is basically we need this decade to really spin up kind of these more engineered permanent solutions and get them to the scale and the price point that they become an attractive carbon removal option. And we'll go to the next slide. Basically, what I'd like to leave you guys with is that our real delivery, this was very much a first pass at using the available data that we had to try and answer these questions. And I think our real deliverable here, though, was we have an open source GitHub repository that you guys can, you're free to go to. All our data is available there with a lot more detail on the assumptions that we made. And so you can, download that, play around with the data, look at our assumptions, make your own assumptions, remake all these visualizations, and really, this was based on the 2020 Stripe data. There's now a full, 2021 data set. We very much invite you. We love to kind of get feedback and, talk through our assumptions now, but we invite you to really run with this. There's a lot more data coming out as carbon removal grows very quickly. So I think I will leave it there.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan, Jenny, Shashank, and Jason. This is fantastic. Again, truly the postcard from the future that we were alluding to when we were talking about this event prior. For some comments, Ryan from Orbach from Stripe, feel free.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for doing this work. I mean, when we are very grateful that projects were willing to make their data public in our applications and sort of were okay with that. That was something we weren't sure about at first. And seeing it be used totally independently for really interesting analysis like this is just really cool. And this work was not done for us. It was, you guys just went and did it. And now we're making it available to everyone. So we're just here to say we think it's really cool. Hopefully this is useful, and happy to help out with questions or anything from here. And also, we have a new batch of data that was released in our 2021 project applications a few months ago. So if anyone wants to go play with that, please do. There's less nature-based stuff in there and more newer, more permanent solutions and some smaller volumes. So I would be curious how that shapes up in a similar model.
Yeah, that's one key point for this. This is a living, breathing model, and that as the industry has future RFPs, the data that comes from those will go into refining and pivoting the projections so that we can get a more accurate picture of what the future is going to look like. Without any more delay, Jason, Jenny, Ryan, Shashank, happy to, you've been monitoring the chat. Which questions would you feel like you'd like to address off the top?
I might punt to you here, Ryan. I did not do a very good job of monitoring the chat.
Yeah. So I'm just a couple comments before we dive right in. A lot of this data obviously is already parsed in carbonplan.org. So you can pull more data anytime. The Stripe 2021 data is there. Some data from Microsoft is there. Their RFP for their negative emissions request. What's interesting about the Microsoft data is that it is costless. There's no data there. However, it would be really cool to see what would happen if we used the data acquired through these Stripe proposals and applied it to the Microsoft data. You could get a better picture of today's market. You could see exactly how many carbon removal credits are being offered. Are they actually carbon removal, or are they just traditional avoided deforestation type emissions? I think Microsoft said that while they bought some order, was it like 1 million tons, that they got offers for only 5% were carbon removal, the rest were avoided emissions. So it's definitely the space is small enough that if anyone wants to start digging through all this data, you can pretty much get all the data on the market in one place today, and it will be easier to keep up with over time to make sure this data stays relevant. A lot of these other comments in the questions in the comment section are very methodological. So Jason, if you wanted to pull up, share your screen for the methodology appendix.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. Kind of walk through some of these questions if anyone wants to get real technical.
Can we, is it fine to share this, just a link to the slides now, because it's read only right now?
If it's read only, then yeah, I think let's go ahead and put it in here.
I'll just paste it in, and I'll also share my screen so you can walk through some of your appendix. So there's a link to the slides, and then share screen.
So Jenny, since you covered the forests section, do you want to go through the methodology for the forest land use, if there's any land use considerations, or how you quantify that? If you can go up to the appendix before that, yeah.
Sorry,
two appendices.
Absolutely. Yes. So admittedly, that was really not, so we did not go that deep in terms of like partitioning out how much everything is going to need. And so the forestry, so in general, we kind of took, there were kind of two ways that we approached this. One was defining kind of the biophysical limits that other people have, quantified. Like, there are lots of estimates exist for saying like, what is kind of the biophysical limit to how much carbon removal could we get by 2050 from these different pathways. And so that was one of our metrics. That was kind of like the max. Nothing was going to go over those biophysical limits, but in many cases, that's kind of looking at pathways by themselves. So, there's not a lot of trading off between if I do too much soil carbon, I'm not going to be able to do as much forestry. And so those dynamics are not currently taken into account here, but is absolutely something that somebody should like work into this because it's critical. And so great for pointing it out. And I'm sorry that we didn't go that deep. And then the other half is saying, okay, how fast is it going to grow in the interim? So like, how fast, what is going to be like a compound annual growth rate through the next decade and beyond. And so for forestry, that was derived from looking at the historic data from the voluntary carbon offsets database. So basically looking at how fast have we increased our supply of forestry offsets over the past decade, and using that as kind of at least first order projected rate into the future. So hopefully that answers questions about forestry, but if not, let me know. And I also, feel free to email me or ping me on Slack. In general.
It might be worth just making a general comment. So, we made a lot of projections kind of based on the past and based on companies' projections. Companies tend to make projections based on what they hope is possible, what's in their pitch deck to their investors, back of the envelope calculations, and so on. Like, not dishonest, but optimistic. And in any case, it's just one projection of the future. So we took a bunch of those projections of the future made this year and just kind of like plotted them, right? It's worth looking at how we could obtain very different correlated returns or results. Like maybe everyone's wrong in some direction. So what might that look like? So at the end of this paragraph, I'll pass off to Ryan, who might want to talk a little bit about that. He made some constrained projections, but let's just say everyone is optimistic and all these projections are too rosy and we don't get to that supply that's needed. So we don't get to the kind of like 1.5 to 2 gigatons that are basically going to be needed by 2030. If we end up in that scenario, what's going to happen is all the credits that are out there are going to kind of spike in price because there's a lot more demand for them than there is supply. But that price can't get like infinitely high, because what will happen is companies will say, well, we're trying to buy these credits, but we just can't afford to like literally go out of business to be net zero. And if every company is in the same boat, all these emitters are in the same boat, then they're just going to throw up their hands and say, what do you want us to do? Either we're going to give up and do nothing, or we're just going to admit that it's all greenwashing and buy kind of cheap credits of dubious quality that are not represented here, but like the even worse quality. We'll pay someone to like maybe think about going on a hike through a forest instead of actually planting trees or something. It's bad news for the planet, but you could imagine that scenario kind of playing out. Another scenario that could play out is some technological improvement happens in the next 8 or 9 years that's not really represented here, and things change like more drastically than expected. So maybe like fusion happens, and therefore the large power requirements behind the direct air capture approaches kind of like disappear, and we just like build all these DAC plants everywhere, and the supply is like much larger than expected, and the total cost is much lower than expected, and that's great. So we're thinking about those two scenarios that might play out. Ryan, do you want to talk at all about your constrained predictions, maybe?
Yeah, sure. If you want to go down that section, I ran a couple of quick scenarios, looking at things that might happen, like Jason just mentioned. One of them was, okay, what happens if these upper bounds are hard to hit, right? So a recent paper came out in Nature saying that wind and solar, fantastic. They're deploying at a massive rate, but the deployment rates actually are limited for one reason or another, whether that's the challenge of finding new projects to develop because of land constraints, or maybe there's some capital flow issues. At some point, your rapid adoption curve turns over and it becomes an S curve, right? So what I've shown in this graph here is, okay, we projected all these deployments, the certain deployment rates for all the CDR in this portfolio, or I guess in the world, not the portfolio. And what happens if we kind of, not an asymptote, but create soft upper bounds to where it becomes harder and harder to deploy for these. And you see that if you go to the next slide, actually, you can see what happens over 2030 or 2035. Any constraint to this upper bound of what we're hoping happens after 2030 can just crater the total supply of CDR. And that is, well, frightening, right? Because we're talking about getting to 2050 and we need 10 or more gigatons of carbon removal. If there are some kind of constraints that we are not foreseeing right now, or some kind of challenge that, you know, sounds easy today, but is much more challenging than expected when we get there, we need all hands on deck. We need more companies, we need more land or more options in the mix. So even in the next scenario, actually, this goes one step further. I say, you know, Microsoft just said that one of their carbon removal projects is burning in Oregon. And you know, they have not, that in a presentation they gave with Carbon 180 the other day, they said that they are not yet ready to stop buying trees for carbon removal, but the thought has crossed their mind. And that's that kind of argument, you know, means you could easily start constraining improved forest management or soil carbon, where the permanence or the additionality is a little bit more in question sometimes, depending on if it's no-till or whatever. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
There's one thing to add on to this, and I think this is an excellent explanation. It's really cool to see this all paced out. It's very likely for obvious reasons that like each of these pathways will hit different constraints at different times and have different dependencies. And I've only seen like quite large error bars for what some of those might be, whether on arable land or on soil, or on, you know, DAC co-located with certain energy sources, because that will change also. And I'm not sure how much work is being done or even could be done given the uncertainty on modeling like what asymptotes and plateaus could look like per pathway. But that's something that I think is super interesting to start thinking about, especially if you're thinking about long-term financing of some of these projects, and getting like a clearer curve out into the future. So I think this is a really excellent flag and just very much the right thing to be thinking about on a lot of this.
Yeah, in slide 60 and 61, we took it just one step further and said that early supply, while we're in this kind of transition state into becoming more comfortable with CDR for forestry or soil, let's say there's more oversight required to make sure those are really good carbon removal credits. You know, that means that we could see earlier upper bound constraints on deployment for those type projects. And then in slide 61, you can see what really happens to the supply in that yellow curve on the bottom right. We could easily end up, even including nature-based solutions, with less than a gigaton of CDR available in 2030. If people like the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets are saying that the demand's going to be at 1.5 to 2 gigatons, does that mean that this becomes a demand-driven pricing market? In which case, everyone in direct air capture now has a business case because people are willing to pay the $200 or more per ton. Just interesting things to pull out of this data. A lot of fun playing with it. Definitely hop in the GitHub, make your graphs, share them on Slack or whatever. They're all fun.
Tito asked in the chat a while ago, any recommendations for entrepreneurs thinking about starting companies these days, getting into these industries? There's probably 50 or 100 companies to be started, honestly, like surrounding this whole industry, and just the large numbers, the 30 to 60 billion within 8 or 9 years is like encouraging. Lots of money flowing into an area indicates it could be really starting companies there. I would say the more we looked at this data, the more we realized that first, all these points are kind of like all over this graph. You're selling credits, which companies want to buy a credit and have it be kind of fungible and like equal to something on the ground. They want to be able to put on their website that they're net zero, that they're green, and they don't want to have some reporter coming to them a year later and saying, you said you were green, but all of your credits burned or something. They want something reliable. Some of them do. And yet, all of these assets are of different qualities, different types. So there's definitely room for, first, like consulting companies to help corporations buy credits the right way, because it's a lot of like institutional knowledge you need to even purchase these credits. Even better though would be maybe like markets or insurance products that kind of take these credits of differing qualities and different colors and so on, and like project them closer to a common basis. That way they could be purchased by companies on a more fair ground. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I'd be happy to chat. I'm kind of going a little bit in that direction lately, thinking about what types of companies one could build in that direction. Finally, another thing is there's just not nearly enough transparency. So, I mean, all of these points being sold up here, they're mostly going to be verified in the present, but what happens a year later or 5 years later? Is anyone continuing to check up on those credits, make sure that they haven't evaporated or burned or whatever? We could definitely use like watchdog groups and so on to I just want to see a dashboard which just shows like how much of someone's balance, how much of Microsoft's balance is still there versus like has leaked out and they need to top up. This would put pressure on companies first to actually top up and buy more credits, which would result in more money flowing in, which would be great. Also, it would push companies to consider the risk when they're purchasing these credits, which would lead them to steer their dollars toward more reliable credits, or maybe to purchase insurance for their credits, which would result in more money flowing. So I think all those
if anyone is
quite interesting.
If anyone is working on that sort of continuous verification type approach that Jason and others mentioned, would love to talk about it. We would love to help you go, help verify our purchases as well. Doing this is an extremely different task for forestry versus macroalgae versus direct air capture. It's like different instrumentation, people with different expertise, like very much a physically different problem. I'm not sure if one company can do all of it or there will be specialists in certain areas, but this is something that is a really big gap in the ecosystem. Like today, we are not going and taking our own physical measurements of these projects. Conceptually, we should be, but we just aren't yet. And the infrastructure to do so credibly doesn't really exist. And that just is a gap that as the volumes increase will become more and more important. So yeah, please work on that in addition to considering starting carbon removal companies. And I can see Raphael in the chat on post-transaction verification. Raphael's from Microsoft. We are both thinking about this and wanting someone to help us with this. So please consider helping companies like us with this.
Just scrolling through the chat for other questions. I haven't kept up with all of the questions. Anything stick out to any of you?
one of the questions in the chat is about how entrepreneurs can think about Stripe and Microsoft and Shopify as buyers in the space and helping them sort of de-risk their scale up. I just wanted to reiterate that what we at Stripe do is frequently try to be the first buyer for really high potential carbon removal tech businesses. And so for 7 of our 10, that's exactly what we are. And so to the extent that you are starting a carbon removal company, you have technology that you're really excited about, but the commercialization stage is what feels like the biggest obstacle. That's sort of Stripe's sweet spot, and like would love for the folks from Microsoft and Shopify to chime in about their work as well, and are certainly happy to chat to entrepreneurs about that. We have seen that these types of purchases can then go out and help organizations raise capital, secure different types of financing, hire great talent, et cetera. And so we're really trying to build that super positive flywheel for these new organizations such that you can grow and scale more quickly.
Paul is asking in the chat, when will Stripe start purchasing biochar? Can either of you say anything more about Stripe's overall strategy and preferences? I mean, Hannah, you mentioned Stripe basically is funding even basic research, which is great, very early stage purchases. Can you say more about Stripe's overall strategy though?
Yeah, Ryan,
Yeah.
biochar.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to the biochar and sort of the question generally. I mean, the strategy is similar to where we were a few months ago, right? We're trying to be an earlier the first customer for promising approaches that meet our criteria, particularly around things like permanence and land use, with the idea being that, especially given the uncertainty of assumptions around how some of the nature-based stuff is going to grow, and the fact that those approaches are currently close to market prices anyways, we really want to ensure that the sort of other half of the spectrum is going to develop. And in practice, though, like, even as a first customer, like the dollar area under these cost curves is huge, right? To actually bring something down and do that kind of learning is tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for many of these projects, right? And like these cost curves are really plateauy, right? In some cases they're smooth, but in many cases they're based on large deployments. So we want to come in and help people get to scale initially. Like our sweet spot, or not even to scale, just like build something. Like our sweet spot in our previous round of purchases was like be the first customer for your 1 ton a day, 365 tons a year reactor, and we'll buy out a year or two of volume of that just to try to help you get it built. And then we do a conditional renewal, primarily for $1 million in most of these cases, where like if you can actually deliver on your small demonstration amount of tons, there's some guarantee that there will be additional volume. That is like not nearly enough for these projects to actually be de-risked and get to scale. And we totally recognize that and are working on sort of facilitating larger purchases as much as we can. But, for some, their initial volume is really small and they just need something, and then they can blend that with venture and get out of the lab and start working. But we recognize that like, it's not nearly enough money to actually solve this by any means. And also that we need way more projects getting started. And as for biochar, other folks have purchased biochar. We certainly think much of it is promising. It is, depending on the feedstock and the OTC ratio and things we can get into, it's probably fairly permanent. We've looked at it. I think it is on the edge of things we are likely to purchase from. I think we're most interested in supporting things with this deeper cost curve. But if folks are working on biochar, we can follow up on that. I know Microsoft has purchased some, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's certainly impactful. It's sort of in the middle of the spectrum.
Okay, let's say, first of all, give a round of applause to the presenters. Thank you so much. This was excellent. Thank you, Jenny. And by the way, Jenny, congratulations on completing your PhD. Thanks, Ryan A. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Shashank. And thanks, Ryan O. and Hannah for coming today. If you have any other questions for the team, their emails are printed on the front of the slide deck. So you can contact them that way. A few other things I want to leave you with. I mean, for one thing, this is really fantastic, literally industry-defining work that you've done, and all as a result of just volunteering your time at a problem pack, which can be quite rigorous, quite fun. You can find more of these problem packs at climatesprints.com if you'd like to participate in one. There are problem packs on not just modeling, but different methods of carbon removal. One key thing that we touched on earlier is that this data is going to need to be updated. There's new RFPs coming out all the time. Public information is becoming more available. Thank you, Shashank, for sharing climate sprints. Public information is becoming more and more available on carbon removal methodologies and carbon removal projects. So we're looking for people who could potentially take a new problem pack of updating this, understanding the assumptions, validating them, and taking the model to the next level. That would be something that would be a fantastic thing for people to work on, and quite interesting as well. So if you're interested, go to climatesprints.com and contact John Sanchez as part of that. One other item I wanted to also touch upon is that this kind of information is extremely important for startups to understand how the costs are going to change and duck and move over time. That there are, as you can see, the implications of this model of the forecasts here are that there are a huge amount of opportunities available in carbon removal, and furthermore, that sharing these ideas in AirMiners is we've heard is a way for making those connections. We hope to create a space where people can devise solutions that will overcome some of the hurdles to make sure that we can get to gigaton scale and beyond as rapidly as possible. That's why we wanted to put out the Launchpad program, so that we can get more entrepreneurs, get them up to speed, get early stage entrepreneurships, startups up to speed more quickly, so that we can have the impact of removing carbon from the air as rapidly as possible. That's a true takeaway from what I saw, that working with others in AirMiners, working with the community, I hope to think that that's where that's how we can make an impact and make a difference, just by sharing information, networking, and getting involved with bringing your startup to the next level by joining programs like Launchpad. Finally, on Launchpad, August 31st we currently have applications open right now. August 31st is the deadline date for the next batch, which we aim to start in mid-September. So feel free to look at launchpad.airminers.org. Thank you. And come build your future carbon removal startup with a select group of other startups in AirMiners.
We would love to purchase from Launchpad companies, for what it's worth. Jason and I have spoken about this, but if you're doing Launchpad, do feel free to reach out. And we're super excited to see the companies in the batch and help out however we can.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Last housekeeping item is that AirMiners events. We're having for those of you in AirMiners Slack, we're having a huddle this Friday at noon Pacific. So using the Slack huddle feature. So go to the general channel. If you're in AirMiners Slack, join us there. Second, we're having a Canadian AirMiners event on Thursday, the 26th at noon Pacific, with a panel of people from Planetary Hydrogen, Carbon Cure, Stacy Kalk from Shopify, and Alexandra Tavsoli from Solistra are going to be there with Omar Sadoun as the moderator. Email for that already went out. The final event that we're plugging that we saw, I hope you all saw, save the date about, September 1st. Tim Flannery is going to be having a conversation with AirMiners about ocean and mineralization strategies for carbon removal. Among other many titles, he's also done an excellent TED Talk on seaweed for carbon sequestration. We're going to be speaking with him for the better part of an hour on September 1st. Please join us. Email just went out to start registration just now. So with that, I'm going to bring us to a conclusion, share some links for our event survey and other AirMiners resources in the chat. So thank you so much. Feel free to stick around for networking afterwards, and we'll see you at our next event.